The Xbox Original, the console that got popular pretty much exclusively via Halo, Xbox Live, sports games, and Halo. A system that was almost entirely geared towards frat boys and horny teenagers. Or at least, that's what the Chinese government would have you believe. I mean, that's what I thought. However, upon peeling away this surface level impression and taking a deeper look at the console, I suddenly realized the Xbox is actually really fucking rad. Contrary to popular opinion, the original Xbox is actually quite an unsung treasure trove of deep cuts, weird novelties, and hidden gems. It was a console that was genuinely trying to create a new, unique, one-of-a-kind brand. One with its own feel and aesthetic, distinct from Sony and Nintendo. Yet, it's one with a legacy that's unfortunately been undermined by history. As generation by generation, the brand has slowly become streamlined and sterile. Despite outselling both, the Xbox hasn't gained half the cult status as the GameCube or the Dreamcast. Which is such a shame because there are just so many unorthodox but high quality games in its library. Ones which are just begging to find a bigger audience. But before we get into those, I think a vibe check is in order. I mean, just look at this user interface. As my friend accurately describes it, booting the Xbox up is like being beamed into an alien spacecraft. It's just such a specific vibe. You see, by contrast, the PS2 was sleek. It was smart and minimal in how it presented itself. An empty void filled with simple crystal geometry, featuring simple menus with only a few options. The Xbox couldn't be more different. It's super loud and busy. Thick spherical grid lines in the background, these convoluted esoteric 3D shapes up front, and just detail everywhere. Clicking into a submenu is not an act to be taken lightly. Here it'll get you ripped out of your seat and thrown into an entirely new orbital sphere. And I'm sure at this point I don't need to point out to you how everything is coded in this aggressive shade of neon green. It's a wacky and audacious aesthetic, but it's all tied together by a simple message: power. The Xbox was designed to be the most powerful system on the market, and it wears that on its sleeve. Like, compare boot-ups. The GameCube's is fun, it's playful and almost toy-like. The PS2 is surreal and imposing, like you're being sucked into an alternate dimension of entertainment. The Xbox's boot-up is, look at how powerful our console is. Yeah, see that green alien goop? That's what our console is running off of. That's how advanced it is, bitch. Comparatively, it's weirdly literal, and I can see why some people wouldn't like that, but I can't help but appreciate just how audacious it is, and how bizarrely creative it is as well. Like, there are a million ways to show off how your console is technically powerful, and yet they decided to do it with Nickelodeon slime and an alien aesthetic. Yeah, you're welcome, Alienware. Yeah, it's a bit tacky and very early 2000s, but within the chronology of consoles, it's an entirely unique aesthetic, and very expressive in a really fun, cartoony way. And that's the key word here, expressive. Out of all the teams responsible for creating these user interfaces, with the alien tech and the spooky sci-fi soundscapes, I get the sense that the Xbox team was having the most fun. Even including this legendary Easter egg where, if you let it rest for long enough, it will start spitting this creepy robot garble at you. It's a very particular attitude, best embodied by the fact that the prototype for this console was literally a giant X. Completely stupid? Yeah, sure, but at the same time, also pretty wicked. With the marketing for the console and games also being appropriately edgy, with some commercials being straight up banned. But as it figures, this branding did not work for everyone, as the console famously flopped hard in Japan. And to anyone familiar with typical Japanese sensibilities, It's pretty obvious why this giant hulking tank of a console didn't fly over there. The main controller and console itself were just too big. The aesthetic too American. You see, if the PS2 was a slick Suzuki street bike, then the Xbox was a thick 600 horsepower Camaro, a fat slice of American muscle. And while that may have been great for a YTV-obsessed 2000s kid, the Japanese weren't having it. Which is why it's so insane that there are as many really good Japanese-developed exclusives as there are. Like, in spite of their terrible efforts to win them over, Microsoft really wanted a piece of gaming's heartland, which is why they managed to secure deals with Tecmo, FromSoft, Capcom, and most importantly, Sega. And it's because of this support that you can actually dive into a surprisingly deep pool of bizarre weeb games on the Xbox. The most obvious and financially successful being Ninja Gaiden, which, while never a series to reach Devil May Cry sales or notoriety, started an undeniable beast of a hack-and-slash trilogy. Though I do find it funny how the most successful Eastern game on Xbox was also the most superficially generic. I mean, based on the cover, it's basically Ninja the Game. No, we need to get weirder. So in comes Magatama, a really gorgeous action game that was only released in Japan, and one that wears its foreign fantasy influence far more prominently. But still not weird enough. Nah, for that you need to check out the criminally overlooked Otogi games from Software. As many of you will know, before Soulsborne took off with the mainstream, FromSoft was just this eccentric Japanese developer making all sorts of niche, off-kilter games. Otogi 2 in particular being one of the craziest pieces of Japanese fantasy I've ever consumed, featuring developer signatures such as an esoteric storyline and character stats that barely make any sense. Speaking of FromSoft, some of you may be familiar with Metal Wolf Chaos, a game that was originally Japan only, but made it to the West through sheer meme power. As this is a game where you literally play as the President of the United States, gearing up in a mech suit to fight for his country's last shred of freedom and liberty.
I'm on the move. I'll smash it faster than a Florida recount.
Proving that a dumb gag and bad voice acting is all some games need to find an audience. But it's far from the only Xbox game to receive a revival, as cult favorite Phantom Dust recently earned a huge boost in renewed interest thanks to this retrospective by Nick Robinson. Based on what I've heard, it's a genuinely exceptional action game, featuring a real-time card-based PvP system. And it's just one of the games on this system that could and should experience a renaissance. Stop! Chief among them being the god-tier Sega exclusives. As mentioned earlier, no Japanese dev came to aid Microsoft half as much as Sega did. This was in part due to the tech giant helping them out with the development of the Dreamcast, and so when that console bit the dust, the Xbox inherited most of its cancelled games. In many ways, the Xbox is as close to the Dreamcast 2 as we ever came to getting. For one, it's the only way North Americans could play Shenmue 2, the sequel to one of my favorite games of all time. A series that managed to gamify talking to strangers and made picking up random household objects fun. Then you have Panzer Dragoon Orta, which, all hyperbole aside, is possibly the greatest on-rail shooter ever produced. A simple game with some dense lore, it's the finale to a series that tragically never got the success it deserved, mostly due to it being stuck on the Sega Saturn and then, well, the Xbox. You also have the excellent third-person action game Gun Valkyrie, the console-exclusive port of House of the Dead 3, and perhaps the game that best embodies the Xbox's hidden underbelly of weird, colorful anime games, Jet Set Radio Future. An experience that just oozes early 2000s edge and charm, and an extravagant depiction of urban counterculture. While there were dozens and dozens of extreme sports games in this era, all of them trying to be edgy, most just came across as cynical, trend-chasing cash-ins. Whereas the truly innovative and earnestly expressive Jet Set series was the real deal. Yet it was another game that deeply underperformed on the console. Highlighting the sad truth about the Xbox. that this was a system with a splintered audience. At the end of the day, it didn't matter how many cool, subversive games were on the thing, because ultimately, the audience that Microsoft pushed hardest for was not the type of crowd that would be able to appreciate them. Consoles are, for the most part, not really desirable products in and of themselves. They're just a gateway to enjoy other products, in this case, games. And so just like how a club or a musical venue has to attract an audience by consistently showcasing artists that suit their clientele's taste, consoles have to deliver a library that is consistent with their target demographics' interests. This is the reason the Dreamcast has such a strong cult following. Its library is just an incredibly homogenized cluster of oddball Eastern games, a crystallized time capsule of Sega and the Japanese game industry at a very specific moment in its history. It had its niche audience and went all in on appealing to them. The Xbox's marketing pitch, on the other hand, was good graphics, online gaming, Tom Clancy, Madden, and Halo. And that's a focus that is going to attract a very particular crowd. One unlikely to appreciate deeply unconventional games like Shenmue or Togi. And that would be fine. Obviously you can't attract everyone, but I feel as though once Microsoft realized that people were only coming to their console for mainstream American games like Knights of the Old Republic and GTA, there was another element of their brand that they lost. The weird, unconventional American stuff. More than just the best way to play games online, the original Xbox had that super distinct, campy charm to it. And there were just so many offbeat and niche Western games that complement its colorful and wacky tone. Kung Fu Chaos, for example, is an excellent 4-player party brawler, one I remember fondly from my childhood. It's such a creative, funny game. The concept being that the fights are actually all just elaborate scenes being filmed to make a bunch of cheap martial arts and exploitation films, leading to some really crazy off-the-wall scenarios and spectacle. And there were a lot of oddball party games for this system, Fusion Frenzy and Whacked being chief among them. The former having that Ultra 2000s sci-fi theme going on, and the latter feeling like a cancelled Adult Swim show. You also have a personal guilty pleasure of mine, Mad Dash Racing, a very imperfect but super unique kart racer, featuring stupidly open-ended track design. It's flawed, but to fans of the genre who want something completely different, I would recommend it. Though bear in mind that I also like Sonic R, so maybe take my recommendation with a grain of salt. And being a 6th generation console, you know you're in for some mascot platformers. While Sony was able to create Jack, Ratchet, and Sly Cooper, who all went on to spawn their own complete franchises, Xbox had the Go Nowhere, Voodoo Vince, Blinx the Timesweeper, and Torque, at least 2 of which were actually good. Blinx is a game created by Naoto Oshima, of Sonic and Nights into Dreams fame, featuring his signature, surreal, and gorgeous cartoon aesthetic. And don't let the reviews of the time fool you, the game itself has actually held up pretty well. Trust me, once you get past the ultra-dense UI, it's good, albeit difficult, fun. The sequel ain't half bad either. But if that's not your speed, you also got Voodoo Vince, a more conventional but equally high-quality platformer, one notable for its more macabre theme, featuring a dark New Orleans setting and a protagonist who fights enemies by killing himself. A great alternative to the more typical sunny platformers of the time, without being super try-hard about it. I'd also rep Psychonauts, but it eventually got ported to the PS2, so. But let's say you're not into that kitty mascot shit, but still want something more obscure and interesting. Well, in that case, Crimson Skies has got you covered. A genuinely super exciting aircraft action game set in an old history America with a unique diesel punk aesthetic and world. Recommended to anyone who loves Rogue Squadron or the like. Meanwhile, you have the console-exclusive port of Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth, a very unorthodox horror mystery game with little emphasis on action and more on exploration and lore. And probably the most faithful gaming adaptation of Lovecraft to date, made even before Lovecraft became mainstream popular. And really diving deep into the realm of the niche, you've got Death Row, a super obscure but really well put together sci-fi action game that reviewed excellently but completely flopped. So we've covered the cartoony and we've covered the more mature, but lo and behold are the many games that do both. Notably the Oddworld titles, a series with such an inherently niche appeal. The Oddworld games are for people who want dark, moody atmosphere, anti-capitalist messaging, and gore, but want it in a cartoon aesthetic with fart jokes and villains named Gluckons. While its biggest entry on the Xbox, Stranger's Wrath, is a game for people who want a first-person shooter, but one starring a hairy alien cowboy who shoots bugs from a crossbow. You also, of course, have Fable, which, while a much bigger game that, on the surface, seems like a very palatable, generic Western RPG, is secretly just as goofy, different, and expressive as anything else on the system. Elder Scrolls it is not. And I don't think there is a single better game that embodies the OG Xbox's spirit than the classic Conquer Live and Reloaded, which, while originally an N64 game, just feels so much more at home in the 6th generation. Like, just look at this image. It's like everything about the Xbox brand crammed into one picture, featuring a multiplayer shooter starring commando squirrels against Nazi teddy bears. Again, speaking to just such an unorthodox crowd. It's a game that very overtly knows it's stupid, but tries to be cool anyway. In a lot of ways, just like the Xbox itself. It's crass and goofy and a little bit tacky, but just so expressive and not afraid to be different. Ultimately, the Xbox was the first console in its line, and much like the liquid green jelly in its boot up, it was a fluid, unrefined brand, one that had yet to find its audience. So they tried to capture everyone. They tried to win over the Japanese, they tried to win over the weirdo kids, and they tried to win over the normie chads. And ultimately, the normie chads prevailed. As while the early days of the 360 still had the brand retaining some of its edge, releasing its fair share of creative Japanese and American games, the focus slowly continued to shift more towards mainstream fare, with the Kinect and Xbox One era firmly cementing the brand into corporate normieville. And today, with the Series X being not much more than a glorified service provider for Game Pass. Unlike Nintendo and Sega, Xbox was never really able to cultivate its own fan subculture, rather just becoming the safe and ergonomical option on the market. And with Xbox games continually developing into a monopolistic conglomerate of major studios, I don't think the brand will ever be a unique entity again, but rather is doomed to just be another corporate branch of Microsoft. But with all that said, in a way things are actually looking up, as through their Game Pass model, I think the Xbox team has actually managed to reassert themselves as a studio capable of producing not just big hits, but smaller, more interesting games as well. Not to mention, is the perfect format to help better expose people to smaller, more personal indie games. So while that current user interface may be generic as hell, and while Halo and Forza might still get top billing, that odd, deep-rooted spirit of expression is still hidden away in there. And it all traces back to the weird, uneven legacy of the Xbox original.